Okay, welcome back to Intro to Philosophy. My name's Tom, and in this unit, we'll continue our discussion of metaphysics and talk about two arguments for the existence of God. As you can imagine, in metaphysics, the existence of God is a big topic, and so we'll consider two famous arguments. One of them is by St. Anselm, which is called Anselm's Ontological argument, and the other one is Pascal's wager. So let's start off, we'll take them in turn. We'll start off with Anselm's ontological argument. So this is possibly the most famous argument for the existence of God. And it's actually fairly straightforward. To begin, it is important to consider the kind of classic definition of God in the Western world. Anselm is a medieval theologian, and I believe he was a monk. And anyways, he is in the medieval period and in the modern period, and even in contemporary discussions, God is kind of considered to be an infinite being, right? God is the creator, God is omniscient, omnipotent, perfect, all these kinds of things. And so this is part of what we think about when we think about God, at least in the Western world. It's one being, and it has all these attributes. It knows everything. He, I guess, depending who you're asking, uh, is all powerful, so on and so forth. Okay, so Anselm creates initially a definition for God. Right? And he says that he defines God as that than which there is no greater, right? And so the idea then is that if you can think of something that is greater than whatever conception of God you currently have, then that new conception is God, right? God is the thing that you cannot think of something greater than, right? By definition. Right. Okay. And so based on this, he considers the following proposal. Think of a God that doesn't exist. Okay. Think of a God that does exist. Okay. Which one's greater? Right. The one that does exist. So based on that definition, if God is that than which there is no greater, right, an all-powerful, infinite being without limitations, then it follows that God has to match up to that greater conception, which is something that exists, right? So I break this down in my notes into a premise one, premise two, and a conclusion, right? So premise one, God is by definition that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Premise two, a conception of God that exists is greater than the conception of a God that doesn't exist. Therefore, by definition, God must exist. Part of this, to really understand this, is to think about this conception of God that we have, right? And part of the conception of God that is this kind of classical conception is that God has necessary existence, right? This goes in hand with the idea that God is a creator, right? God's existence and God's position, so to speak, in the universe is not one that is contingent upon any other event or condition or context or anything like this, right? That God has no parents, right? And the idea is that God had to come into existence. God has to exist. And so in a way, what Anselm's argument does is kind of tease this out, right? By kind of giving a proof for the existence of God. Now, there are some classic objections to this as well. Right? I think Anselm was writing in, I don't know, 1100 or something like that, right? So we've had a lot of time to process this. So Guanillo, I can't pronounce it. Anyways, he has an objection, and this is his perfect island objection. And this is the idea that, imagine the most perfect, greatest island you can. And you say, okay. And then Guanillo says, well, does it exist? Right. And you say, I don't know. I'd have to go look for it. Right. And Guanillo says, that's my point. Right. Just because an island is more perfect than every other island, it does not entail that that exists. And the broader idea here is that your conception of something does not entail that it exists. Right? This is a general idea about how concepts function. A more refined version of this is Kant, who says that existence is not a predicate. So predicates are attributes that we give to objects, right? So you say the cup is made of metal, the house is made of wood, the shirt is blue, all those attributes that you tack onto properties, those are predicates, right? And he says that existence is not a predicate, that adds an equality to an object. Kant gives this example of, thinking of $100, an imaginary $100, and a real $100, right? The real $100 is not worth any more than the imaginary ones, right? It doesn't change the value or the determination of the $100. It's just in one case that you actually have $100, in one case you don't, right? And it's really important to make sure that the attributes don't change. So when you're asking a question about whether or not you have $100, when you find $100, you know that what you found is the same thing that you were thinking about before, right? Didn't shift. Um, so this is, a lot of people like Kant's response. A couple things for context. One is I always like to point out here, we're talking about arguments for the existence of God and stuff, that both Anselm and Guanillo are Catholic theologians, right? I think they were both monks. So it's not that Guanillo was some kind of rogue atheist trying to prove him wrong. He just didn't like his argument, right? And furthermore, I always like to point out, if people are familiar with the idea of Occam's razor, um, it's usually paraphrased as the simplest solution is usually the correct one. That's not quite right. Occam was a very serious theologian and metaphysician, but Occam was also a Catholic monk. Right? So if you want to use Occam's razor for to prove atheism, look to where it came from. So anyways, this is just to say, and even Kant, with the $100 example, was also Christian. So, you can agree with the conclusion of an argument, but not think that the argument itself is good, right? That's kind of the point I want to make. So the second argument we will talk about is Pascal's wager. And this one I like a lot. It's very interesting. Pascal takes a very different tact to proving, in some ways, that we ought to believe in God, not necessarily that God exists. Pascal, that is kind of a difficult article to get through, but if you look at it, he does say something to the effect that it is fundamental to being a Christian for him that one has faith in the existence of God. So Pascal's actually not really much of a fan of strategies like Anselm's, because he thinks if you prove that God exists, then that takes away your ability to have faith in God. And that kind of takes away a certain fundamental aspect to being a Christian, where you really have to have faith and not know that God exists. But nonetheless, he takes this kind of pragmatic approach to arguing for the existence of God. And he asks us, well, kind of, it's called Pascal's wager, right? It's about making a bet on whether or not God exists. And he asks us, what's at stake when we believe in God? What is the consequence of believing in God, and what's the consequence of being an atheist? And so he lays out the consequences in the following way. He says, okay, if you believe in God, And we're talking about death, what happens when you die and presumably you find out that God exists or God doesn't exist. He says, well, if you believe in God and there is a God, well, then presumably you go to heaven, you have eternal life, and everything's fantastic, right? If you believe in God and there is no God when you die, then, well, nothing really happens, right? Um, on the contrary, if you don't believe in God and you die and there is a God, well, you suffer eternal damnation, right? You go to hell. Um, but if you don't believe in God and there is no God, you're right, nothing happens still, right? So if you kind of weigh the pros and cons, believing in God has the possibility of having kind of eternal happiness, going to heaven. On the downside, there's no real downside, just nothing happens, right? Contrary, if you don't believe in God, the upside is really nothing, but the downside is pretty bad, right? And so Pascal kind of looks at this and he says, well, believing in God is definitely the better bet, right? And so this is a different strategy here, but it's also a kind of a famous thought experiment, if you will, about whether or not we ought to believe in God. So these are just a couple of arguments to think about and spend your time with. Try to process them a little bit. They're both pretty good. They're rich thoughts about the existence of God. And yeah, that's it for today. And I will be talking with you shortly.